Okay, welcome back to Smart Irrigation. This is video 3. We're going to talk about modules and sensor groups. We already covered how to install. We already covered the general and zones in previous videos. So let's get started. So modules are calculation modules. You can have multiple modules. You can mix and match. So you can have multiple times the same zone, for example, to try out different configurations of the same module or the different modules that you might have available to you. So there's the Pareto module, the static, and the pass-through module. So I'm going to talk about the static and the pass-through first. Static is very easy. It is a setup delta. So it basically means every time this zone is being calculated, subtract this value from the bucket. So it's always going to be 10 or minus 10 that you will set the delta to, right? So this basically means I'm setting a static evapotranspiration to shortcut all the calculations. Pass-through is when you have an evapotranspiration sensor configured in your weather station, you want to use this module if you want to use that value as the delta. Not all weather stations have it, but if you have a weather station that provides it and you have your sensor group set up for it, use this module, and then that value is being used as the delta, effectively shortcutting any calculation again. Now the Pareto module is the most complicated one, but also the most powerful one. And this actually takes temperature, wind speed, dew point, humidity, etc., solar radiation into account to calculate and estimate the evapotranspiration. So you can set up whether you're not in a coastal environment, or you can specify how you want to calculate solar radiation. So solar radiation is by default estimated from temperature. You can also estimate it from sun hours, so you can try which works better for your location, or you cannot estimate. And when you not estimate it, it basically assumes you will have a solar radiation sensor set up in the sensor group that is related to this zone on which this model lives, that tells us exactly what the solar radiation was. And then the last one, very interestingly, forecast days. So this is the number of forecast days you want to take into account. This is not enabled if you have no OEM Open Weather Map API set up. If you don't have it set up, you can always go into the configuration settings in the option settings for your module and add it. Also, if you want to change the key, you can go in there and change it. So forecast days allows you to specify how many days you want to take into account when calculating. So for example, let's say you had a very dry day and and tomorrow is going to be a wet day, right? The weather forecast says tomorrow is a wet day. Well, if you just took into account today, you might actually see that when it's raining tomorrow, your sprinklers are running, which doesn't make a lot of sense because, hey, moisture is already coming from the sky. Why am I irrigating? So with forecast days, I can now specify how many days in advance I want to look at the forecast to maybe decide not to irrigate, right? So let's say you had a dry day followed by a couple wet days. Well, you know that the forecast tells you a couple wet days are coming, so by setting these forecast days, the calculation can actually balance itself out and say, well, we have 5 millimeters lost today, right? But I know tomorrow we're going to add 7. So effectively, the bucket for these 2 days is going to be 2. So we don't need to irrigate, right? Or I lost 5 today, so the bucket is minus 5. Tomorrow we're going to add 3. Well, the bucket is still minus 2. So yes, we do have to irrigate, but not as much as we did if we didn't take the forecast into account. So that's where you can use the forecast for. Now each module can be configured to one or more zones. Now the sensor groups are where you wire up your sensors to your weather station, your weather service, or to Open Weather Map. So let's scroll down to the Open Weather Map one. Open Weather Map one is the easiest. You just specify for each source, you specify Open Weather Map as the source. So for each entry, like dew point or humidity, you specify Open Weather Map. Open Weather Map doesn't provide evapotranspiration nor solar radiation, so those are not available for Open Weather Map. But you can also just set static values or sensors for any of these, right? So you can say, Open Weather Map is great, but it doesn't really have a good humidity reading in my location, so I want to swap that out for a sensor that I might have, or I want to add a static value, right? So always set this one to 50. This is great, for example, if you have a greenhouse, because in greenhouses normally it doesn't rain. So you can have a total precipitation not coming from Open Weather Map, but set it to 0, because it doesn't rain in a greenhouse, so I don't need to take that into account when calculating how much water gets lost from the soil, right? So that's how you can use this, for example. So you don't have to have everything from one source, you can mix and match in here as well. Now here's one that is set up for a weather station. So I have a weather station in here, and now I see all the Home Assistant sensors in here that the weather station provide. This might be my weather station or my neighbors or some weather service that I use more reliably than Open Weather Map. And I can just specify the sensors in here, can specify the units it's providing in, and then I can also specify an aggregation. So this is very important. Normally we would use the average, but sometimes you want to use something else just to experiment with. For example, the most common one is precipitation. Most weather stations actually provide a total precipitation, not the actual precipitation at a certain moment, but the total for the day, like the daily rain rate, for example. In that case, you don't want to take the average, because it starts with 0 and it ends with, I don't know, 50 millimeters. Well, the average would be 25 during the day. That doesn't make sense because it rained 50 millimeters. So in that case, you want to use either the last or the maximum value. So you can use average first, last, maximum, median, minimum, or sum. So just in case, for example, you have an actual rain rate, then you can take the sum to calculate the total rain, right? Or maximum, which would be the default behavior. For pressure, you have multiple units that your weather station might provide information in, and then pressure can be relative or absolute. Most weather stations provide relative pressure, but if you have one that provides absolute, you can switch it over here to absolute, so we can do the right calculation to convert it to relative before we actually start working with it. So that's basically how this works. If you have solar radiation set up, don't forget in PyITO to say the estimation mode is do not estimate, because otherwise we'll just ignore this value and take, for example, the temperature or the sun hours to figure out the solar radiation. So if you're measuring it, make sure your PyITO actually takes it as a concrete measurement. So then over here, there's a help page that just leads you to our GitHub, so that's fine. So on the zones, again, I can then select the right sensor group, and then I can select the module. So here, interestingly, you can have the zone multiple times. So you could have your sprinklers for your lawn, for example, here, one of the zones, and multiple setups. So you could say, hey, I'm just gonna try a pure open weather map, or a pure weather station, or one with a third-party weather service, or a combination of those. And then also gonna try a different configuration of the PyITO module, for example, to see which one is best to my actual location. So it provides loads of options to tweak to your actual situation at your home. So you can absolutely have each zone represented more than once, which is great because it's not tied to your valve, so you can absolutely do that. And then each zone will represent itself as a sensor in Home Assistant. So over here, we'll have my sensor, and I can see the size, the throughput, and the bucket as well. And then the status of this is 0 in this case, which basically means you don't need to irrigate, but the duration here will change depending on the irrigation requirements. So that's it for smart irrigation. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about automations and how you can actually make this talk to your irrigation setup.